When a very caring person stops forgiving others all the time just to feel safe, something big changes. The world they thought made sense starts to break apart. People they once believed were kind start to show their tricks and hidden control. Friendships they thought were real begin to look more like one-sided deals. And the hardest truth of all, they realize even their own kind mask was just pretending. They weren't forgiving because of love or strength, but because of fear. Forgiving again and again had become a way to survive, even though it slowly wore down their soul. Picture the familiar scene. The person who betrayed you once more comes to you with words rehearsed in sorrow, their eyes moist, their tone soft, and you, faithful to your nature, say, "It's all right." You let their shame pass into your body as if you were a vessel designed for other people's redemption, while your own nights are spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if your worth is measured only by how much pain you can carry for others. But this time, the machinery does not work as it once did. The well of silence inside you does not yield the same tired compassion. Instead, there rises something ancient, an anger not born of pettiness, but of sanctity. It is not explosive rage, but a steady fire, a storm long suppressed. Jung named this encounter the collision with the shadow, the point at which the self, long silenced, finally demands its rightful place in the light. The empath, stepping into this collision, discovers that forgiveness was never pure compassion. It was what I would call survival forgiveness, a disguise of virtue woven from terror, terror of being abandoned, terror of displeasing others, terror of being marked as unloving or cruel. From childhood, they were taught that their worth depended upon absorbing pain without protest, that their silence kept love intact, that their sacrifice ensured belonging. Jung described this as the mutilation of the authentic self in exchange for social acceptance. But when the empath withdraws this unconscious agreement, the scaffolding collapses. The structures of manipulation that thrived upon their quiet consent begin to crumble. And in the dust of that collapse lies a startling discovery. Their shadow is not a monster, but a guardian. It contains righteous anger, sacred boundaries, and the forgotten ability to preserve the self. Jung was clear that enlightenment does not arrive through dreaming of angels, but by making the darkness conscious. For empaths, that darkness is not evil, but instinct, the raw knowing that says no when someone seeks to consume them. When they awaken, they are not growing cruel. They are retrieving the pieces of their soul they abandoned in exchange for fragile peace. What follows is a series of transformations, subtle but unmistakable, that mark the passage from a forgiving shadow to an authentic self. I call them signs of sacred rebellion, though Jung himself would have seen them as the milestones of individuation. The first sign is the reversal of energy. The empath who once acted as an emotional landfill begins to ask the question that changes everything. Is this mine to carry? They recognize the exhaustion etched into their body after encounters that were never mutual. They discern the difference between genuine remorse and manipulation veiled in apologies. For the first time, they stop assuming responsibility for regulating the storms of others. As Jung said, clarity begins when we look inward, and once the empath gazes at the tired vessel they have become, they can no longer pretend. The parasites sense this before it is spoken. Emotional vampires slip away because they cannot siphon from someone who is finally awake. The second sign is the death of performance. Jung described this as the fall of the persona, the social mask crafted to earn love and acceptance. For empaths, this mask was endless patience, unbreakable tolerance, the false smile that said, "It's fine," when their chest was burning. But when forgiveness ceases to be automatic, the mask feels like a corpse pressed against their skin. They stop rehearsing excuses for bad behavior, stop applauding those who never showed up for them, stop offering labor without reciprocity. Jung warned that this unveiling is terrifying, for people will mourn the performance they depended on. Yet he also reminded us that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, even if it disappoints the audience who preferred the play. The third sign is vision, the sudden ability to see manipulation where once there was only fog. Jung's study of projection explains why. Empaths who forgive compulsively project their own integrity onto others, assuming sincerity where there is only strategy. But when forgiveness ceases to be reflex, the eyes sharpen. Love bombing becomes visible as bribery dressed as affection. Guilt trips reveal themselves as leashes disguised as tears. The empath realizes their compassion has been weaponized, turned against them to weaken their walls. Now, the unconscious becomes conscious, and they can finally see others as they are, not as their wounded heart hoped them to be. The fourth sign is the collapse of guilt. What once served as the whip of compliance loses its sting. Jung recognized guilt as often nothing more than shame borrowed from others, a control device designed to keep souls obedient. The empath begins to feel what I would call guilt immunity. They no longer apologize for drawing boundaries. They do not tremble at being called selfish, for they know selfishness has been misnamed all along. It is not cruelty, but the breath of survival. The voices that once manipulated them with guilt are exposed as desperate pleas to restore the old order, where the empath quietly bled so others could thrive. The fifth sign is the great sorting. Relationships transform when the foundation shifts from sacrifice to authenticity. Jung described this as the natural upheaval that occurs when the authentic self emerges. Exploitative ties wither without the nectar of self-abandonment. The manipulators fade, the users retreat, while a few rare souls step closer. Drawn not by your compliance, but by your wholeness. Jung compared the meeting of two true selves to a chemical reaction in which both are transformed. Only authenticity allows this alchemy to occur. The sixth sign is sacred anger. The empath who ceases automatic forgiveness finally listens to the fury they once buried. It is not destructive chaos, but protective flame, a signal that their soul is reclaiming its territory. They revisit past betrayals with new eyes, grieving the boundaries they never set, grieving the nights they gave away their dignity in the name of peace. Jung said, "Consciousness cannot be born without pain. This pain is the furnace, and within it, new strength is tempered." The seventh sign is pattern recognition. Freed from emotional fog, the empath's intuition sharpens like a blade. They see the cycles repeating: betrayal, apology, love bombing, relapse. What once felt like unique tragedies now reveals itself as a script, enacted by different faces but written by the same hand. This is not paranoia, but discernment, the consciousness Jung described as differentiation, where the soul perceives clearly without distortion. The eighth and final sign is the emergence of the authentic self. For the first time, the empath finds their own voice echoing in the silence. They discover desires they had buried under others' demands. They realize their needs are not shameful, but sacred. They are no longer fragments held together by compliance, but a whole being standing in the fire of their own truth. Jung named this encounter with the self, the culmination of individuation, where one integrates both shadow and light into a living totality. Yet, Jung did not promise comfort in this rebirth. He warned that the journey often feels like a dark night of the soul. To the empath, it resembles social death. Friends vanish, family resists. Accusations of selfishness echo from the mouths of those who fed upon their endless pardon. The empath grieves not only lost relationships, but the false self they carried for so long. Jung spoke of roots reaching into hell if a tree is to grow toward heaven. So too must the empath descend into their underworld, confront the rage and grief they buried before they can rise into a life of wholeness. As they withdraw their forgiveness, something else becomes unveiled, not only the manipulations of others, but their own hidden motives. They realize that forgiveness was not only kindness, but a way to avoid abandonment, a strategy to secure love through sacrifice. To admit this is not to shame oneself, but to be liberated. It means they can finally offer forgiveness consciously, not as currency, but as gift. This new forgiveness is not immediate nor compulsive. It comes after truth is spoken, after justice is met, after consequences are endured. Jung insisted that real forgiveness does not suppress justified anger, but honors it, releases resentment without erasing reality. It is forgiveness that sees, remembers, and yet chooses not to be consumed. This transformation redirects the flow of energy once squandered on endless pardon. Freed from being a receptacle for guilt, the empath begins to create, to dream, to live for themselves. Projects long abandoned are reborn. Passions once silenced find their place in the daylight. They invest in connections that nourish, no longer seduced by those who only take. Jung called this individuation, not selfishness, but the flowering of a complete human being who gives from fullness rather than lack. And as this path unfolds, something extraordinary begins to ripple outward. The empath who no longer offers blind pardon becomes a mirror that others cannot distort. The narcissist, once shielded by your endless understanding, is exposed to the raw truth of accountability. The manipulator, who twisted compassion into chains, finds the links shattered. The emotional leech, starved of your life force, must finally face their own emptiness. Jung knew this moment as the great unmasking, not only of others, but of yourself. Because when you stop carrying what was never yours, when you cease forgiving as an act of fear, you are confronted by the truth of your own shadow. That forgiveness had often been your way of bargaining for belonging, that love was confused with compliance, that silence was mistaken for virtue. To see this is painful, but it is also the doorway to liberation. From here, forgiveness is reborn, not automatic, but conscious. It is not a bypass of truth, but a companion to it. You forgive after the wound is acknowledged, after the boundary is honored, after the consequence has been lived. This forgiveness is clear-eyed and sovereign. It heals without erasing. It releases without pretending. And with that shift, energy once drained through endless pardon now flows into creation, into dreams, into the wholeness of your becoming. Your body breathes easier, your spirit stands taller, and even your health begins to change, as if your cells themselves rejoice at no longer being battlegrounds for other people's chaos. You begin to live as a lighthouse, steady, luminous, guiding others without abandoning yourself to the storm. You stop repeating generational patterns of sacrifice, showing that sensitivity does not require erasure, that kindness can coexist with strength. And perhaps the deepest paradox is this: only when you stop forgiving everyone do you finally learn to forgive yourself. For the years you stayed too long, for the times you swallowed your truth, for the love you mistook for bondage. Jung said, the most terrifying act is to accept oneself completely. Yet, this is the sacred threshold the empath crosses. You realize your worth was never measured by how much pain you could hold for others. Your love was never meant to be earned through silence. Your soul was never born to be a vessel of endless pardon. It was born to be whole, to burn with its own fire, to say no as sacredly as it says yes. And in that awakening, the masks fall, not just theirs, not just yours, but the world's illusion itself. What remains is the authentic self, unchained, unmasked, and undeniable.